Imagine you are standing just off stage,
Yeah.
right? You're hidden by this heavy velvet curtain, and in, say, 10 seconds, you are going to walk out into the glare of the spotlights to deliver a career-defining presentation to 1,000 people.
Oh, yeah. That is a terrifying feeling.
It really is.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, if public speaking isn't your specific nightmare, imagine you're sitting in this sterile room staring at the first page of an exam that's basically going to dictate the rest of your professional life.
Right, or even just a mundane one. You're driving, and suddenly the car ahead of you just slams on its brakes, and time kind of seems to freeze.
Exactly. You know this feeling. We all do. It's that immediate, violently physical cascade. Your heart starts pounding against your ribs like it's, I don't know, trying to physically escape your chest.
Yeah, your palms get slick with sweat, your throat tightens up.
Right. And your breathing gets super shallow and fast. So in that exact fraction of a second, as that physiological storm hits, what is actually happening?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right, because are you about to conquer the moment, stepping into this state of peak human performance, or are you about to completely collapse, freezing up and just buckling under the pressure?
And, the instinct for most of us is to blame the room or the test or the traffic. We blame the situation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the difference between conquering and collapsing isn't in the situation itself. It's in the unseen, microscopic neural architecture of how you appraise it.
Yeah, and it is a really profound shift in perspective when you realize that the external world doesn't actually dictate your internal biological reality.
Which is hard to accept, honestly.
It is, because we desperately want things to be visible and easily categorized. We tell ourselves, this exam is objectively difficult, therefore I am objectively failing, or this emergency is terrifying, so I must freeze.
But the biology tells a completely different story, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The brain actually possesses entirely distinct circuit boards for what it perceives as a challenge versus what it perceives as a threat. And I really want to emphasize, this isn't just some fluffy psychological concept.
Right. It's not just like having a positive attitude.
Exactly. It's not a motivational poster. This is a hardcore physiological divergence that fundamentally changes the chemistry of your blood, the literal width of your veins, and the physical wiring of your neural networks.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because today, our mission is to embark on an exhaustive deep dive into the last 10 years of psychology and neuroscience.
And it's been a busy 10 years in this field.
Seriously.
Sure.
We are looking at how our appraisals of stressful situations dictate our actual physical performance. We're going to tear down the engine of the human stress response and look at the structural brain changes, the network connectivity, and the biomarkers that determine whether stress acts as a weapon you wield or a weakness that takes you down.
Which is a fantastic journey to go on.
And to do that, we have to start with the foundational math equation that your brain is just constantly running in the background. It's called the biopsychosocial model of challenge and threat.
Yeah.
Or just the BPS model.
Right. And if we look at the origin of that model, we really have to credit researchers like Jim Blaskovich and Joe Tomika.
Right, from back in the 90s.
Yeah, their foundational work, which heavily culminated around their seminal 1996 papers, established this mathematical equation that is happening entirely beneath your conscious awareness.
So we don't even know we're doing the math.
Not at all. Whenever you enter a motivated performance situation, meaning any scenario where you actually care about the outcome, where it's relevant to your goals, your brain acts like this hyper-fast supercomputer.
Okay.
And it weighs two very specific factors against each other. It weighs situational demands against personal resources.
Okay, and just so we're crystal clear for everyone listening, situational demands are the obstacles, right? It's the uncertainty of the outcome.
Yes.
It's the physical danger, or maybe the social danger of looking foolish, and just the sheer amount of mental or physical effort required to get through the next 5 minutes.
Exactly. While your personal resources, on the other hand, are your arsenal. This is your existing knowledge, your raw skills, the muscle memory from past experiences. And, incredibly, it also includes your social support system.
Oh, wait. Social support counts as a resource in this fast math equation.
It really does. Do you feel backed by a team, or are you entirely alone? The brain runs this calculation in milliseconds. So a challenge state occurs when your brain calculates that your resources meet or exceed the demands.
It looks at the obstacle and decides, hey, we have the tools for this.
Precisely. And a threat state occurs when the brain calculates that the demands far exceed your resources. It looks at the obstacle and concludes, we are outmatched, we're going to fail.
I've always loved thinking about this like a bank account.
Oh, that's a great way to frame it.
Yeah, so let's say you go out to the mailbox and there's a massive, unexpected tax bill.
Yep.
That bill is your situational demand. If you log into your banking app and you see that you have plenty of funds in your savings account to cover it, those are your resources.
Right.
Now, your heart might still beat a little faster. It's a lot of money. It's super annoying. You still have to actively go write the check and pay it. You are engaged, but you pay it. That is a challenge state. You are highly stimulated, but you're capable.
It's functional arousal.
Exactly. On the flip side, if that exact same bill arrives and you log into your account and your balance is zero, you panic. You literally brace for impact. The demand has completely eclipsed the resources. That is a threat state.
And that bank account analogy maps perfectly onto the biology because the body literally follows the math of that appraisal.
Okay, walk us through the biology of that.
So in both the challenge and the threat state, the initial alarm bell is the exact same. Your body activates the sympathetic nervous system, the SNS.
This is the classic fight or flight response, right?
Yes. Adrenaline floods the system. Your body knows a bill has arrived, basically, and it needs to wake up and deal with it.
Right. Your heart rate goes up either way. You don't just take a nap when a $10,000 bill shows up.
Exactly. But here is where the physiological paths diverge. In a challenge state, your body is optimizing for immediate high-level performance. It actively improves cardiac efficiency. We see an increase in cardiac output, which means your heart is actually pumping a significantly larger volume of blood per minute.
Oh, okay.
And crucially, it triggers vasodilation. Your blood vessels actually relax and widen. This decreases total peripheral resistance in your vascular system.
It's like opening up the highways.
Opening the highways is a perfect way to put it. It sends a massive, unimpeded rush of highly oxygenated blood directly to your brain and your skeletal muscles. You become, biologically speaking, sharper, faster, and more focused.
That's incredible.
And furthermore, a challenge state has a rapid onset and a rapid offset. You gear up, you execute the task, and your body returns to its baseline homeostasis very quickly.
So you pay the bill, you close the app, your heart rate drops, and you just go make dinner.
Exactly. But the threat state triggers an entirely different secondary cascade. Because the brain has calculated that defeat is imminent, it activates the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis.
Okay, the HPA axis, that's the big one.
Yes, this is the system responsible for releasing cortisol into your bloodstream. And cortisol does something fascinating and terrible in this context. It tempers that initial sympathetic response. It causes vasoconstriction.
Meaning the blood vessels shrink.
Yes, they physically restrict and tighten, which drastically increases vascular resistance.
So the heart is still pounding away trying to pump blood, but the pipes have suddenly shrunk.
Exactly. It severely restricts blood flow to the extremities and to the brain. And because cortisol stays in the system much longer than adrenaline, it results in an incredibly slow recovery. The stress lingers for hours, sometimes days.
Okay, wait. I really have to push back on this because logically this feels like a massive design flaw in the human body.
How so?
Well, isn't a threat just a harder challenge? Like if I am facing a threat, if the demands are completely overwhelming, wouldn't I want maximum brain power to figure a way out? Why does the body actively restrict blood flow, literally starving my prefrontal cortex of oxygen when I need to outsmart the problem the most?
It feels like self-sabotage.
It definitely looks like self-sabotage in the modern world, but if we look at it through the lens of evolutionary biology, it is a brilliant survival mechanism.
Brilliant. Well, your body is not optimizing for a math test. It's not optimizing for a PowerPoint presentation or a difficult conversation with your boss. It is optimizing to prevent you from bleeding to death from a predator attack.
Oh.
Yeah. In a threat state, the brain has run the math and assumed that you cannot win the fight. Therefore, physical damage and defeat are imminent.
Oh, wow. That is dark.
It is. So vasoconstriction, tightening the blood vessels in your arms and legs, keeps the blood centralized in your core. It protects your vital organs, and most importantly, it minimizes blood loss when the bear inevitably bites your arm or, a rival tribe cuts you. It is essentially a preemptive tourniquet. It's an evolutionary damage and defeat protocol.
That is deeply unsettling, but it makes perfect sense. So if you're listening to this and you're standing at a podium looking out at an audience and you feel entirely unprepared, your demands exceed your resources. Your brain literally restricts blood flow to your logical thinking centers because it genuinely believes you are about to be physically torn apart by a predator and is trying to save your blood volume.
Exactly. You are experiencing a social evaluative threat, but your vascular system only knows how to prepare for a physical laceration.
Wow. Okay, so If this resource versus demand equation is dictating whether our blood vessels open up or clamp shut, where exactly is this calculation happening? If we want to look at the structural changes and the network connectivity in the brain over the last decade of research, how does feeling threatened physically rewire us?
Right. So if we really want to understand how the brain physically changes under threat, we have to look at brains that have been pushed to the absolute edge of human endurance. We have to look at soldiers returning from active combat zones.
Okay, high stakes.
Very. There's a fascinating paper that came out in 2011 in the journal Molecular Psychiatry by a researcher named Wingen and colleagues. It's titled Perceived Threat Predicts the Neural Sequelae of Combat Stress.
What do they do?
They essentially tracked a cohort of soldiers, putting them in fMRI machines to look at their resting state functional connectivity before they deployed to a combat zone, and then again after they returned.
So they're getting a baseline scan, sending them into one of the most objectively demanding high-stress environments on planet Earth, and then seeing what the war physically did to their neural network.
Exactly. And the findings completely upended what many people assumed about trauma and stress. When they analyzed the brain scans alongside the data of what the soldiers actually experienced, they found that actual objective combat exposure, the sheer number of firefights, the proximity to explosions, the objective danger, did not strictly determine the changes in the brain's functional connectivity.
Wait, really?
Really, it was the perceived threat that altered the physical wiring of the brain.
That is wild. So you could have two soldiers in the exact same Humvee experiencing the exact same firefight. But if Soldier A appraises it as a challenge and Soldier B appraises it as a threat, their brains wire themselves completely differently when they get home. It wasn't the bullets, it was the appraisal of the bullets.
Yes. The appraisal was the architect of the neural change. For the soldiers who reported high perceived threat, the scans showed a reduced negative coupling between the amygdala and the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, or the DACC.
Okay, let's translate that a bit. The amygdala is our primitive alarm bell, right? The fear center. And the DACC is supposed to be the brakes.
That's a really great analogy. The DACC is a regulatory region. In a healthy, regulated brain, when the amygdala fires up and screams danger, the DACC engages to assess the situation and, if necessary, cool the amygdala down.
Okay, so it pushes the fear down.
Exactly. That inhibitory relationship is what we call negative coupling. As one goes up, it pushes the other down. But high perceived threat fundamentally weakened this connection. The regulatory brakes were worn down.
So the alarm is blaring, and the system designed to shut it off is just disconnected.
Yes, but it gets worse. Not only were the brakes disconnected, but the researchers found an enhanced coupling between the amygdala and the insula.
The insula, remind us what that does.
The insula is a region deeply involved in interoception.
Interoception being your awareness of your own internal bodily sensations.
Correct. It's how you feel your heart pounding, your stomach churning, your lungs gasping. So, appraising the environment as a high threat uncoupled the fear center from its logical brakes and hardwired it directly into the part of the brain that makes you hyper-aware of your own bodily panic.
That sounds like the literal neurological blueprint for a panic attack.
It really is.
Because your amygdala fires, your insula makes you intensely, overwhelmingly aware of your racing heart, which the amygdala then interprets as more danger, causing it to fire harder, which the insula feels more intensely. It's just an infinite feedback loop of terror.
It is a profound amplification loop. And, we don't just see this in combat veterans. We see this exact mechanism in civilian populations dealing with everyday anxiety.
Really? Where?
Well, there's a brilliant study by Robinson and colleagues from 2012 published in NeuroImage. It's called The Adaptive Threat Bias in Anxiety: Amygdala dorsomedial prefrontal cortex coupling and aversive amplification.
Okay, what was their setup?
They brought people with varying levels of anxiety into the lab and had them process fearful faces while scanning their brains.
So just looking at pictures of scared people.
Yes. And they found that anxiety induces a positive connectivity between the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, the DMPFC, and the amygdala.
Wait, but the prefrontal cortex is the highest level, most evolved part of the brain. It's the CEO. Why is the CEO positively connecting with the primitive fear center? Shouldn't it be shutting it down?
Under normal circumstances, yes. But in an anxious brain appraising a threat, we see a top-down aversive amplification mechanism. The DMPFC essentially turns into a magnifying glass for threat.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it directs conscious executive attention toward the scary thing, actively exciting the amygdala. The cognitive brain is telling the emotional brain, yes, look at that, it's terrifying, pay more attention to it.
I mean, I guess I can see how that's useful in very specific context. If you're walking to your car in a dark, empty parking garage at 2 a.m., you want that threat bias. You want your executive brain magnifying shadows and sounds so you can spot a threat before it gets to you.
In short bursts, it is highly adaptive. But here's the critical takeaway for anyone listening who struggles with chronic stress. This brings us to the foundational principle of neuroplasticity. Neurons that fire together, wire together. The brain is an efficiency machine. It prioritizes and strengthens the neural networks that you use the most.
So if you are chronically appraising your emails, your social interactions, and your daily tasks as threats.
If you constantly recruit this DMPFC amygdala amplification circuit to deal with everyday life, you are literally laying down thicker neural cables for fear. You are building a more efficient, structurally robust fear processing machine.
That is terrifying.
The Robinson paper explicitly notes that if this aversive amplification circuit is chronically recruited, it correlates highly with trait anxiety and a deep vulnerability to clinical anxiety disorders.
So we are literally building the architecture of our own anxiety through our daily appraisals. That is sobering.
Very much so.
But, we've talked about what happens under pure emotional threat, like looking at scary faces or being in combat. But life usually demands more from us than just being scared. What happens when you take that emotional threat, but then you force the brain to also solve a highly complex, difficult problem at the exact same time? How does the brain allocate its energy when the alarm is blaring, but there's work to be done?
To understand that, we really have to look at what I call the network wars. The brain has finite metabolic resources, right? Only so much glucose and oxygen to go around. Under immense pressure, it has to decide which networks get the fuel.
Okay.
A really illuminating look at this came out in 2021 by Cause and colleagues in the journal Human Brain Mapping. The paper is titled, Facing Successfully High Mental Workload and Stressors.
Facing successfully. That's the key word. We want to know what the brain does when it actually beats the stress.
Exactly. They designed a brilliant dual-task experiment. They put participants under a very high cognitive load-complex working memory tasks that require intense focus. But simultaneously, they subjected them to the threat of highly aversive, unpredictable auditory stressors.
So you're trying to solve complex math and memory puzzles, and suddenly a deafening, horrifying alarm goes off in your headphones at random intervals.
It's an incredibly demanding environment. And they used fMRI to watch the dynamic interplay between three major brain networks. First, you have the executive control network, or the ECN. This involves the lateral prefrontal and parietal cortices.
This is the CEO we talked about, the task-focused, problem-solving logical network.
Yes. Second, they looked at the default mode network, the DMN, which handles internal reflection, mind wandering, and thinking about the past or future.
Daydreamer.
Right. And third, the salience network, the SN. This includes the amygdala, the hippocampus, the anterior insula, and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. The salience network's entire job is to scan the environment and detect what is important, particularly emotional or threatening stimuli.
So you have the CEO trying to balance the budget, the daydreamer staring out the window, and the security guard screaming about the fire alarms.
That is the perfect cast of characters. And what the researchers found was that successful performance under this intense dual pressure was characterized by a massive, concerted reallocation of neural resources.
What did they do?
Well, the participants who succeeded didn't just ignore the noise. Their brains actively recruited extra activity in the executive control network to maintain an iron grip on the task. But to afford the metabolic energy for that extra focus, the brain induced massive targeted deactivations in the limbic regions of the salience network.
Wait, it actively suppressed the security guard.
It forced the amygdala and hippocampus to power down to regulate the emotional fear. Even more fascinating, it deactivated the superior temporal gyrus.
What does the superior temporal gyrus do?
It processes auditory information.
Oh my God. So the brain literally turned down its own hearing to ignore the auditory threat. It physically dampened its ability to process sound so the CEO could focus.
That's exactly what the data shows.
I picture this exactly like a submarine taking on water in a combat situation. The captain of the executive control network realizes that the hull is breached, and they need all available power to keep the ship from sinking.
Yeah.
So he doesn't just ask people to be quiet. He aggressively shuts down all non-essential systems.
Yes.
He cuts power to the mess hall, he turns off the luxury lighting, he shuts down the internal comms, which is the salience network and the auditory processing, and routes every single available volt of electricity to the pumps and the engines just to keep the sub moving forward.
That submarine analogy beautifully captures the dynamic resource allocation. The brain is actively cutting power to emotional and sensory processing simply to survive the cognitive demand. This extra ECN recruitment and simultaneous deactivation of the fear centers is a highly reliable biomarker of successful mental effort. The CEO takes absolute dictatorial control of the brain's energy grid.
But there has to be a breaking point, right? A submarine can only divert power for so long before something gives out.
There absolutely is a breaking point. If the stress becomes too intense, if the alarms get too loud, or the math problem gets too hard, this delicate metabolic balance shatters. The salience network overrides the ECM.
The security guard tackles the CEO.
The submarine loses power to the pumps, and you experience complete cognitive disengagement. The prefrontal cortex essentially goes offline, and you freeze. You fail the task.
And here's where we get to one of my favorite parts of this research, because it leads us right into a massive controversy in the neuroscience community.
Oh, yes, the big debate.
Right. If the executive control network is so vital, if the CEO needs to stay in charge to keep the submarine from sinking, can we consciously use it to regulate our emotions when we are already stressed out? Can we consciously force the CEO to shut down the alarm system once the alarm is already blaring?
This has been a deeply heated debate for years. For a long time, the prevailing wisdom in the field was just no. Studies from researchers like Rao around 2013 and Zahn in 2017 strongly suggested that acute stress rapidly and catastrophically disrupts prefrontal network connections.
So their argument was that once the stress hits, the CEO is already dead.
Essentially, yes. The theory was that the cortisol spike from the HPA axis, that delayed lingering stress hormone, acts almost like a toxic shock to the prefrontal cortex. It impairs our ability to use higher-order cognitive strategies to regulate emotion. The consensus was that under severe stress, your logical brain simply goes offline.
So if you're listening to this and you're in the middle of a panic attack or a high-stress moment, the old science was basically saying you can't just think your way out of it, because the tool you use for thinking is broken by the stress itself.
That was the depressing narrative. But then we saw what I like to call the stress test reversals. The science got better, the imaging got clearer, and the paradigm shifted.
What changed?
A critical turning point was a 2017 paper by Sher Mohammed and colleagues titled, "Does Psychosocial Stress Impact Cognitive Reappraisal? Behavioral and Neural Evidence." To test this, they used a variant of the Trier social stress test, and they did it inside an fMRI scanner.
Okay, if you are listening and you've never heard of the Trier social stress test, imagine the most awkward, horrific, public speaking nightmare you can dream up, engineered by sadists in lab coats.
It is truly brutal.
Yeah. The researchers bring you into a room and suddenly tell you that you have 5 minutes to prepare a speech about your personal flaws and why you'd be a terrible employee. Then, you have to deliver this speech to a panel of judges. But the judges are trained behavioral experts who give you absolutely zero positive feedback. No nods, no smiles, just cold, judgmental, stony stares.
And that's just part one.
Right.
Yeah.
And just when you finish sweating through that, they make you do complex mental math out loud, like counting backwards from 2043 by 17s. And if you make a single mistake, the stony-faced judge coldly says, "Incorrect. Start over from the beginning."
It is remarkably effective at inducing massive psychosocial stress. It reliably spikes both heart rate and salivary cortisol levels. So Sher Mohammed and her team got participants highly stressed using this method, and then while their cortisol was peaking, they asked them to use cognitive reappraisal,
which is actively rethinking the meaning of a negative image or situation to reduce its emotional impact.
Correct. They showed them highly aversive images and asked them to consciously reframe them. And the finding was revolutionary. Despite the objectively heightened heart rate, and despite the cortisol flooding their systems, the stress participants' ability to successfully reappraise the images and the actual neural activity firing in their prefrontal cortex were completely equivalent to a non-stress control group who had just been relaxing.
Wait, really? The people who had just been humiliated by the stony-faced judges regulated their emotions just as well as the people reading magazines in the waiting room.
Identically well. And this wasn't a fluke. It was strongly corroborated a few years later in 2021 by Sandner and colleagues in the journal Neuroimage. Their paper, Cognitive Emotion Regulation Withstands the Stress Test, an fMRI study, used a similar paradigm called Stand-Stress-C, which involves doing mental rotation and arithmetic under that same social evaluative jury pressure while inside the scanner.
And what did they find?
They found absolutely no stress-related impairment in the brain's ability to perform cognitive emotion regulation, whether through distraction or active reappraisal.
I have to ask, as someone looking at this from the outside, Why the massive disagreement in the science? You literally have two camps of highly trained neuroscientists looking at the exact same human brain and seeing two completely different things. Is the brain resilient to stress or is it fragile?
It comes down to two highly nuanced factors that earlier research just missed: timing and experimental design. Think back to the two physiological systems we discussed at the very beginning of the deep dive.
The sympathetic nervous system, the SAM axis with the instant adrenaline hit, and the HPA axis with the slow burn cortisol.
Precisely. The human stress response is a deeply complex, staggered dance between those two systems. Adrenaline hits almost instantly, within seconds. But cortisol takes about 20 to 30 minutes to reach its peak concentration in the blood and the brain.
Okay, so the timing matters.
Huge. What Sander and other modern researchers argue is that the older studies that found prefrontal impairment may have measured emotion regulation at the wrong time. They may have tested the participants too early, catching the brain in the chaotic transitional phase of the initial adrenaline spike before the system had stabilized.
Oh, I see. So they were trying to test the submarine's pumps while the torpedo was literally exploding against the hull.
Yes. Alternatively, some of those older studies used continuous, unbroken physical stressors, like forcing a participant to hold their bare hand in a bucket of ice water for the entire duration of the emotional regulation task.
Okay.
That causes massive, continuous baseline shifts in the endocrine system. It essentially exhausts the participant's biological bandwidth.
It's not a realistic model of how we experience psychological stress in the workplace or at home.
Exactly. When you look at the human brain's regulatory networks under a distinct psychological stressor with a clear onset and offset, like giving a bad speech and then stepping off the stage, the prefrontal cortex is surprisingly robust. If you give the brain just a moment to process the state change, the CEO can and does remain online. The data is clear. You can consciously regulate your emotions, even with stress hormones actively flooding your system. The machinery is not broken.
That is incredibly empowering. So since cognitive reappraisal can survive the stress test, I really want to know exactly how this superpower works. If I'm looking at a threatening situation, say I get an incredibly vague, ominous email from my boss that just says, "Come see me," and my heart starts pounding. If I decide to reappraise it, to change my mind about it, what does that actually look like inside the biological wiring of the brain?
To map the architecture of mind over matter, we have to look at the meta-analytic data. A landmark piece of work here is Beal and colleagues' 2013 meta-analysis published in Cerebral Cortex, titled Cognitive Reappraisal of Emotion, a meta-analysis of human neuroimaging studies.
And what did they find?
They aggregated mountains of fMRI data and confirmed that reappraisal absolutely relies on those domain general cognitive control regions we discussed: the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, the bilateral dorsolateral, the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, and the posterior parietal cortex.
The entire executive suite of the brain is lighting up.
But here is the crucial, deeply surprising finding. For a long time, researchers assumed that regulating an emotion was similar to fear extinction.
Oh, it's fear extinction.
Fear extinction is what happens when a lab rat learns that a specific tone no longer predicts an electric shock. The fear fades. That process relies heavily on the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the VMPFC. But Buell found that conscious cognitive reappraisal does not primarily engage the VMPFC.
Wait, really?
Really, reappraisal is not just waiting for fear to fade. It is an active, completely different mechanism. Instead of the VMPFC, the executive control regions modulate the amygdala by altering semantic representations in the lateral temporal cortex.
Okay, let's break down semantic representations for a second. Semantics is meaning. It's the actual definition of a thing, the words and concepts we use to describe it. So if I get that ominous email from my boss, my initial semantic representation is, I'm getting fired. This is a threat.
And your amygdala reacts to that specific string of words and concepts with panic. But when you actively reappraise, you engage your lateral temporal cortex to change the words. You tell yourself, my boss knows I've been working hard on that project and she probably wants an update. This is an opportunity to show my expertise.
So I'm fundamentally rewriting the meaning of the stimulus before the amygdala even gets a chance to process it as a threat. I'm intercepting the code.
You are rewriting the code entirely.
Yep.
And recent machine learning discoveries have illuminated the physical pathways of this code rewriting even further. Gomrudi and colleagues have published two incredible recent papers, one in 2023 called Decoding Reappraisal and Suppression from Neural Circuits, and a 2024 paper called Decoding Acceptance.
Machine learning. Wow, what did they do?
They didn't just look at regions lighting up. They applied complex machine learning algorithms to structural brain data to identify the specific physical networks that predict an individual's intrinsic ability to reappraise stress.
Wait, they can look at the physical structural wiring of your brain and predict how well you can handle a stressful email.
They can. The algorithm identified two key networks that dictate this ability. The first is called IC13, which is the temporo-parahippocampal orbitofrontal network.
That is a mouthful. What does IC13 actually do?
This is the physical pathway for that semantic rewriting we just talked about. In IC13, the prefrontal control regions regulate and adjust the semantic representations in the lateral temporal regions. And crucially, the orbitofrontal cortex, the OFC, acts as the primary inhibitor.
Okay, and what does that mean in practice?
The machine learning model showed that the physical strength of the coupling between your OFC and your amygdala directly predicts how often and how effectively you use reappraisal in your daily life.
So the stronger that physical bridge is, the better you are at changing the story in your head.
Mm.
What's the second network?
The second network is IC20, the sensor motor network. This involves the supplementary motor area, or the SMA. Now, normally, the SMA is involved in planning physical bodily movements. If you are going to reach out and grab a cup of coffee, your SMA plans that action.
Right.
But here, the algorithm found that the SMA exerts top-down inhibitory control over the amygdala during emotion regulation.
This is wild. So let me try to synthesize this. Reappraising a threat isn't just sitting in a chair, closing your eyes, and thinking happy thoughts while your body panics. You are literally engaging the brain's language and meaning centers, the temporal lobe, to rewrite the dictionary definition of the threat.
Yes.
And simultaneously, you are using the motor planning centers, the SMA, to actively physically inhibit the fear response before it hits the amygdala. You are treating the regulation of your own emotion like a complex physical action that you are planning and executing.
That is an incredibly astute way to look at it. You are deploying high-level linguistic hardware and motor planning hardware to dismantle a primitive subcortical emotional response. It is a highly active, metabolically expensive cognitive process.
That is incredible. Okay, so we have the maps of the brain. We know about IC13 and IC20. We know about semantic rewriting. The million-dollar question for everyone listening is, how do we actively hijack these networks? I know the wiring exists, but how do I use it to turn a physiological threat, that blood-restricting, panic-inducing state where my veins clamp shut, into a physiological challenge where the blood flows freely?
This is where we cross from theoretical neuroscience into real-world alchemy. We look at interventions that actually shift the biological balance, and it turns out one of the most remarkably effective ways to hijack the system is simply to teach people the truth about their own physical arousal.
Wait, just teach them the truth.
Exactly. We look at a phenomenal paper by Jeremy Jameson from 2012 in the Journal of Experimental Psychology, General, titled Mind Over Matter. Reappraising arousal improves cardiovascular and cognitive responses to stress.
Walk us through what Jameson actually did, because this sounds too simple to be true.
The setup was elegant. They brought people into the laboratory and put them through a highly stressful evaluative task. But before the task began, they split the participants into groups. For the intervention group, they gave them a very specific set of instructions. They explicitly told them that the physiological arousal they were about to feel, the pounding heart, the sweaty palms, the shallow breath, was not a sign of failure.
Okay.
It was not a sign of panic or anxiety. They were instructed to view that arousal as entirely functional and adaptive.
They basically said, hey, your heart is going to beat out of your chest. That's a good thing.
Exactly. They told them your body is pumping blood to your brain to help you perform better. Your body is mobilizing energy to meet the demand. This is your body helping you.
So they engaged the IC13 network. They gave the participants a new semantic representation for their own heartbeat. Instead of, I am having a panic attack, the meaning became, I am powering up.
And the biological results of that simple semantic shift were profound. By simply instructing participants to reappraise their arousal, they fundamentally shifted the entire cardiovascular profile of the human body. The participants who reappraised their arousal showed increased cardiac efficiency, measurably higher stroke volume from the heart.
Wow.
And crucially, they showed lower vascular resistance. Their blood vessels actively dilated instead of constricting. By changing their belief about their sweat and their heart rate, they biologically shifted from a threat state to a challenge state.
Just by telling them the truth about their physiology. That is mind-blowing. But we can go even deeper than just a lab setting, right? What happens when you take these interventions down to the level of core philosophical beliefs about human nature? I want to talk about that 2016 paper by Yeager, Lee, and Jameson in Psychological Science. It's called How to Improve Adolescent Stress Responses: Insights from Integrating Implicit Theories of Personality and Biopsychosocial Models.
That study is a masterpiece of applied psychology because they took this out of the sterile laboratory and into the messy, chaotic world of high school.
And let's be honest, high school is basically one giant, multi-year, inescapable social evaluative threat. Every day is a try or social stress test in the cafeteria.
It really is the ultimate naturalistic stress environment. The researchers decided to tackle the root of how teenagers appraise social stress. In this study, they taught a group of adolescents an incremental theory of personality. In modern parlance, this is essentially a growth mindset applied to social traits.
Okay, so a growth mindset.
Yeah, it is the explicit belief that socially relevant traits can change, that you are not fixed, your intelligence isn't fixed, and crucially, other people, like the bullies or the popular kids, are not fixed.
So if you are bullied or you experience a massive social failure, it is not a permanent tattoo on your identity. It is a temporary state that can evolve.
Precisely. Now contrast that with the control group, who generally hold an entity theory. An entity theory is the belief that human traits are rigid and fixed. If you are awkward, you will always be awkward. If you fail socially, you are fundamentally a failure.
And I just have to interject here, because when you think about modern teenagers and social media, the internet is an absolute entity theory machine. Everything is recorded, everything is permanent. One mistake goes viral and defines you forever. We are culturally enforcing the idea that social standing is fixed and catastrophic if lost.
That context makes the results of this study even more vital. After teaching these teens the incremental theory, the growth mindset, they later subjected them to a severe social evaluative stress task. And when faced with that task, the teens who had learned the incremental theory evaluated their resources as significantly higher than the situational demands.
Because if you fundamentally believe that you can grow and learn from a failure, you inherently feel more resourceful. You have a safety net built out of your own adaptability.
Yes, and the biology followed the belief. Compared to the control group, the teens armed with the incremental theory showed significantly lower threat appraisals. Biologically, they demonstrated lower acute cortisol reactivity. Their stroke volume was higher, they had less vascular resistance, their blood vessels stayed open, and they showed a much faster return to cardiovascular homeostasis after the stressor ended.
Their bodies literally reacted to the horrifying social stress test like it was an exciting, manageable challenge, simply because they had read a few articles about neuroplasticity and personality change days prior.
And the researchers didn't stop at the lab. In a daily diary component of the study, they found that receiving this intervention actually severed the link between daily social stressors and cortisol spikes in the real world.
How so?
Well, if a student in the control group had a bad social day at school, their cortisol spiked that evening. If a student who had learned the incremental theory had a similarly bad social day, their cortisol remained completely stable. And ultimately, tracking them over time, this biological resilience led to measurably better academic grades months later.
If you are listening to this right now, I really want you to pause and absorb the magnitude of what we're discussing. Does this mean that our physical, biological stress response, the literal amount of cortisol floating in our saliva, the physical width of the blood vessels in our arms, is entirely at the mercy of our deeply held philosophical beliefs about human nature?
The data points unequivocally in that direction. It is the biopsychosocial model operating in its purest form. If your philosophy is that traits are fixed entity theory, then any social failure is permanent. It becomes a massive situational demand. And because you believe you cannot change, you calculate your coping resources at zero.
And the math fails.
Right. The mathematical equation dictates a physiological threat response. But by simply changing the core philosophical belief to an incremental theory, you artificially and permanently inflate the resource side of the BPS equation. You instantly and continually shift the body into a challenge state because you believe you possess the ultimate unbreakable resource, the human capacity for change.
The philosophy dictates the math, and the math dictates the biology. It's beautiful. But let's bring this all home. We've established the neuroscience. We know we can change our physiology through semantic reappraisal and core beliefs. We can actively dilate our blood vessels and suppress our own cortisol by engaging our executive control networks. But what is the final score? Does any of this actually translate to tangible success in high-stakes environments? Because feeling calm and having wide blood vessels is nice, but executing the job is what actually matters.
We have overwhelming meta-analytic proof that the physiological state directly dictates the execution. We look to a massive 2025 meta-analysis published by Haas and colleagues in the EXCLI journal titled The Effects of Challenge and Threat States on Performance Outcomes, an updated review and meta-analysis of recent findings. This paper is the most comprehensive look at the last decade of data in the field.
How big of a study was it?
They rigorously reviewed 62 distinct studies published between 2017 and 2024, encompassing a massive dataset of over 7,400 participants.
You cannot argue with a sample size of 7,000 people. What did the aggregate data show?
The data definitively demonstrates that individuals who enter a physiological challenge state achieve superior performance outcomes across every domain measured. We see it in academic education, in high-stakes healthcare, in professional sports, and in corporate business settings. If you have vasodilation and increased cardiac output, you simply perform the task better than someone with vasoconstriction and a cortisol spike.
Give me some of the most extreme high-stakes examples from that data set. Because we aren't just talking about doing slightly better on a pop quiz. We're talking about life or death scenarios.
Let's look at the medical field. A 2025 study by Betson and colleagues looked at medical students undergoing objective structured clinical examinations, or OSCEs. If you aren't familiar, an OSCE is a highly stressful, simulated medical emergency. The student walks into a room, a patient is crashing, alarms are going off, and they are graded by senior doctors on their clinical decisions and physical execution under pressure.
It's the Trier social stress test with the defibrillator.
Exactly. The researchers measured the students' appraisals before the test. The students who appraised the high acuity scenario as a challenge performed 17% better clinically than those who entered a threat state.
17% better in a medical emergency is an absolute chasm of difference.
Yeah.
That is the difference between diagnosing a pulmonary embolism and missing it entirely. That is the difference between a steady hand inserting an IV and a hand tremor causing a hemorrhage.
Or consider the world of aviation, where the stakes are equally catastrophic. Vine and colleagues published a study in 2014 in Anxiety, Stress, and Coping, where they put trained pilots into highly realistic flight simulators. They threw critical aviation incidents at them: dual engine failures, extreme weather turbulence, system blackouts.
That is intense.
They measured the pilots' cognitive appraisal ratios throughout the disaster. They found that a challenge state directly predicted superior task performance under extreme stress. The pilots who appraised the simulated disaster as a challenge made faster, more accurate decisions. They checked their instrument panels more effectively, their visual gaze was less scattered, and they physically managed the yoke and rudder of the aircraft better.
So if you're listening to this and you're wondering why any of this dense neuroscience matters to your daily life, this is the stake in the ground. This isn't just about feeling a little less sweaty before a Zoom call. It's about whether a surgeon's hands shake when they hold the scalpel. It's about whether a pilot reads the altimeter dials correctly when the alarms are blaring in the cockpit. It is about whether you nail that career-defining presentation or completely stumble over your words because your prefrontal cortex has been hijacked by your amygdala.
The underlying mechanics explain why this happens. The physiology of threat, the vasoconstriction restricting blood to the brain, the heavy cortisol burden, the psychological avoidance motivation actively degrades the fine motor skills and executive function required to perform complex tasks. You literally lose access to your highest skills. The physiology of challenge, the vasodilation, the flood of highly oxygenated blood to the prefrontal cortex, the approach motivation actively enhances those exact same skills. The hardware is optimized.
Okay, let's step back and look at the massive journey we've just taken. What does this all mean for you, the person listening right now? We have journeyed from the subconscious mathematics of the BPS model, deep into the structural wiring of the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. We've witnessed the network wars inside the submarine of the mind, and we've explored the alchemy of semantic reappraisal and philosophical belief. The grand takeaway here is incredibly hopeful. We are not passive victims of our biological stress responses. Through everything we've discussed today, we've seen that the simple subconscious arithmetic of demands versus resources dictates whether our heart pumps oxygen freely to our brain or restricts it in an evolutionary panic. But we control the variables in that equation.
If you take away nothing else from this deep dive, let it be this. The next time you feel your heart pounding before a major event in your life, whether it's stepping out onto a stage, walking into a hostile boardroom, or facing a sudden crisis, Remember the networks we talked about. Remember IC13 and your temporoparahippocampo orbitofrontal network?
Yes.
You possess the neurological hardware to intercept that feeling. You can consciously relabel that pounding heart. You can tell yourself, this is my body giving me the oxygen and energy I need to win. You can actively shift your executive control network into gear, apply an incremental growth mindset to the situation, and completely shut down the amygdala's panic alarm. You are the architect of your own appraisal.
I absolutely love that phrase. You are the architect of your appraisal. But I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, slightly provocative thought to mull over. We've spent this entire deep dive focusing inward. We've talked about how you can internally reappraise your environment to optimize your own brain. But think about the environments you create for the people around you. Think about your role as a manager at a company, or as a parent, or as a teacher. If we know as an empirical biological fact that harsh social evaluation, rigid fixed mindsets, and overwhelming demands trigger debilitating blood-restricting threat responses that degrade performance, are the schools and workplaces we've built actually engineering biological failure? If threat measurably destroys high-level cognitive performance, why do we build institutions based on the threat of being fired or the threat of failing a standardized test? What would a society look like if it was structurally designed to trigger the challenge network from the top down?
That is a deeply necessary question. We spend so much time and money trying to teach individuals how to armor themselves and survive toxic environments rather than simply engineering environments that naturally foster physiological thriving.
Exactly. We're teaching people to hold their breath instead of just clearing the smoke from the room. But until we redesign society, you have the tools to rewrite your own code. So the next time you feel that sweat on your palms as you step up to the stage, remember it's not the stage that matters, it's the math equation in your head. And you have the power to balance the books. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through the resilient, adaptable human brain. Keep diving deep.